When we think of medieval romance, our minds often drift to knights in shining armor, grand gestures and fairy tale endings. But the reality? It's far darker, more twisted and honestly pretty disturbing. Medieval people didn't see love as a joyful, mutual connection between two people. Instead, they invented a whole culture around suffering for love, and they thought that was the best kind of love. This idea was called courtly love, and it was basically emotional self-torture dressed up as the highest form of romance. Imagine a knight falling hopelessly in love with a noble woman who was already married, and instead of moving on, he dedicates his entire life to worshipping her from a distance. He writes poems about his pain, fights battles in her name, and spends years, sometimes decades, pining for someone he can never have. And here's the kicker. This suffering wasn't a side effect. It was the goal. Medieval troubadours, the poets and musicians of the time, turned unrequited love into an art form. They believed that true love had to involve pain, rejection, and endless longing. Getting the girl? That was for peasants. Real aristocratic love meant cultivating exquisite emotional torture and calling it noble. The rules were insane. A true lover had to lose sleep, lose appetite, and basically lose his mind over his beloved. If she showed him kindness, he was supposed to become even more tormented. If she ignored him completely, that was proof of her virtue and his devotion. It was like a medieval instruction manual for developing an anxiety disorder. And the women? They were trapped in this system too. They were expected to remain cold and distant to prove their worth. Showing genuine affection would make them seem cheap or common. So everyone involved was basically required to be miserable to maintain their social status. This wasn't just poetry. It shaped real relationships among the medieval elite. Nobles actually lived this way, turning love into a performance of sophisticated suffering that could last entire lifetimes. The emotional pain was worn like a badge of honor, a sign that you were truly noble and worthy of love. But beneath the surface, this was a deeply unhealthy way to think about love. It glorified loneliness, obsession, and emotional abuse. The idea that love had to hurt to be real is something we still struggle with today, but in the Middle Ages, it was the only way to love. The emotional landscape of courtly love was a minefield of torment. Knights would compose endless verses lamenting their unfulfilled desires, their hearts aching with a pain that was supposed to elevate them spiritually. The more they suffered, the more noble they were considered. This wasn't just about personal feelings, it was a social performance, a way to prove one's status and virtue. Women, meanwhile, were placed on impossible pedestals. They were idealized as distant, unattainable figures whose coldness was a test of a man's devotion. If a lady showed too much warmth, she risked being labeled as common or unworthy. This forced emotional distance created a toxic dynamic where genuine connection was impossible. The whole system was a recipe for misery. Lovers were expected to pine endlessly, to endure rejection and heartbreak as proof of their nobility. It's hard not to see this as a form of emotional masochism, glorified and institutionalized by medieval culture. In many ways, courtly love was a way for the medieval aristocracy to channel their frustrations and desires into a socially acceptable form. It allowed men to express passion without threatening the rigid social order, and it kept women in a position of power, but only as objects of worship, not as active participants in love. This twisted ideal of love left little room for happiness or mutual affection. Instead, it celebrated suffering, longing, and emotional pain as the highest expressions of love. It's a far cry from the romantic ideals we cherish today, and it reveals just how different medieval people's understanding of love really was. If courtly love was the emotional side of medieval romance, marriage was the cold, hard business side. Forget everything you think you know about weddings being about love and happiness. In the Middle Ages, marriage was a transaction, a deal made between families to secure land, wealth, and political alliances. Parents arranged marriages for their children as young as 7 years old. Yes, 7. These weren't just symbolic promises. They were binding contracts with serious financial penalties if broken. A medieval father didn't ask, "Will this person make my daughter happy?" He asked, "How many acres of land come with this deal?" Women were treated like property, walking price tags to be negotiated and traded. The dowry system turned women into commodities. Families literally haggled over a woman's worth like she was a prize horse or a herd of cattle. "I'll give you 3 cows, 50 acres, and my daughter for your youngest son." The woman had about as much say in the matter as the livestock. Marriage contracts read like business mergers because that's exactly what they were. They specified property transfers, inheritance rights, and what happened if the merchandise, the bride, turned out to be defective. If a woman couldn't produce male heirs, her husband could return her to her family like a broken tool. Children were married off to secure military alliances, settle debts, or climb the social ladder. Love was not just irrelevant, it was actually suspicious. If two people genuinely wanted to marry each other, their families worried there might be something wrong with the arrangement. And here's the most disturbing part. Many of these child brides never saw their families again after the wedding day. They were shipped off to strange households, sometimes in foreign countries, to live with people who viewed them as nothing more than expensive breeding stock and political insurance policies. It was human commerce with wedding bells. This brutal system stripped women of their agency and humanity. They were pawns in a game of power, their lives dictated by contracts and negotiations. Love, if it existed at all, was a dangerous distraction from the real business of survival and status. The emotional toll on these young brides was immense. Imagine being a child, torn from your family and sent to live with strangers who saw you as a tool for political gain. The pressure to produce heirs, especially sons, was overwhelming. Failure meant rejection, abuse, or worse. The dowry system reinforced this dehumanization. A woman's value was measured in land, livestock, and money. Families negotiated her worth like a commodity, and her desires were irrelevant. This transactional view of marriage reduced women to objects, stripping away their individuality and humanity. Even the ceremony itself was a formality, a public declaration of a business deal rather than a celebration of love. The bride's feelings were secondary to the interests of her family and her husband's family. Her life was no longer her own. This system also reinforced social hierarchies. Marriages were tools to consolidate power, secure alliances, and maintain wealth within noble families. Love was a luxury that commoners might dream of, but for the aristocracy, it was a liability. The consequences of this system were far-reaching. Women's lack of agency in marriage contributed to their overall social and legal subjugation. They couldn't own property, make contracts, or testify in court without a man's permission. Their identities were tied to their fathers or husbands. In this context, love was not a mutual bond but a social obligation. The idea of marrying for love was so foreign that medieval people literally couldn't comprehend it. Love was something that happened to women, not something they participated in. They were beautiful objects to be competed for, not human beings with their own desires and agency. If you thought medieval love was bad so far, wait until you hear about the church's role. The medieval church didn't just frown on sexual pleasure, it declared total war on it. Their twisted theology turned basic human desire into a demonic conspiracy that would make even the most conservative modern religious leaders blush. Medieval Christians were taught that enjoying sex was a sin. Even within marriage, even for making babies, if you felt pleasure during intercourse, you were committing a sin against God. Sex was supposed to be a duty like taking medicine, get it over with quickly and feel appropriately guilty afterward. The church created an entire calendar of when married couples were forbidden from having sex. No sex on Sundays, religious holidays, during Lent, Advent, a wife's menstrual period, pregnancy, breastfeeding, and more. Do the math, that left about 40 days a year when sex was technically allowed. But it gets worse. Medieval theologians taught that sexual desire was literally Satan working through your body. Before Adam and Eve's fall, humans reproduced without any physical pleasure or desire, like plants pollinating in the wind. The fact that sex felt good was proof humanity was corrupted by evil. Women got the worst of it. The church taught that women were inherently more lustful and therefore more dangerous to men's souls. Female sexuality was seen as a trap set by the devil to drag righteous men into damnation. This created a culture where women were simultaneously blamed for men's desires and punished for having their own. Marriage wasn't a celebration of love. It was a damage control system designed to contain the evil of human sexuality within socially acceptable boundaries. The church literally taught that celibacy was morally superior to marriage, and marriage was only barely better than burning in hell for fornication. On top of this, medieval men didn't just court women, they conquered them. Violence was a romantic gesture. Knights kidnapped women they fancied, and society applauded. If a man risked life and limb to snatch a woman, that proved his love was genuine. Her opinion? Irrelevant. Tournaments were brutal, bloody spectacles designed to impress women. Knights fought to the death, and the bloodier the spectacle, the more romantic it was. Men were expected to fight duels, start wars, and commit acts of brutality to prove their devotion. If you weren't willing to commit at least light genocide for your beloved, you weren't serious. Women were conditioned to find this attractive. Medieval literature pushed the narrative that violent, Dominant men were premium dating material, while gentle men were seen as unattractive. Women were prizes to be won, trophies to be collected. Men didn't marry women, they won them. Adultery wasn't emotional betrayal, it was theft of property. Women had no legal identity separate from their male relatives. Fathers owned daughters until they transferred ownership to husbands. The ultimate romantic fantasy was capturing a woman from an enemy during raids or wars. These traumatized captives were expected to fall in love with their kidnappers. Medieval literature portrayed this as the most romantic scenario possible. And finally, death was the ultimate romantic goal. Medieval people were obsessed with tragic love stories where lovers died for each other. They believed true love was so intense it could literally kill you. Suicide for love wasn't just accepted, it was romanticized. The perfect medieval love story ended in mutual destruction, not happiness. The idea of working through problems or finding love again was shallow and unworthy. Love was supposed to destroy you. Final thoughts. Medieval love was a brutal, controlling, and deeply unhealthy system. It was about power, possession, and pain, not joy, partnership, or respect. The romantic ideals we cherish today grew out of centuries of this dark, twisted history. Understanding this helps us appreciate how far we've come, and how important it is to keep fighting for love that heals, not hurts.